The topic of our inquiry today is the digestive and the urinary system. These are two fascinating systems. In particular, I think the urinary system is absolutely extraordinary. You could spend a whole PhD program studying all the nooks and crannies of the digestive system, or all the nooks and crannies of the urinary system. So we'll just highlight some of the real basic components and how they function in this lecture. We'll start with the digestive system, and in summary, there's one tube that's continuous that goes from mouth all the way to anus. That's called the alimentary canal. And along the way, there are a couple of accessory organs. So the accessory organs would be the liver and the pancreas, as well as some others. The rest of this is all just one tube that has different characteristics as we go along. So the first part beyond the mouth is called the esophagus. That's your food tube, so to speak. And it's pretty muscular. It's also pretty flexible. So when you swallow, it forms a bolus, is what it's called, an enlarged part here that then travels down your esophagus and goes down into your stomach. Now, if we look at the stomach is interesting in that it has gates to it. So there's a gate here, which is basically just a ring of muscle, a thickened ring of muscle that can either cinch down. Think about this being like a donut, and the donut can close to close off exit of anything from the stomach, or it can open up and allow stuff to then pass through. That's called the pyloric sphincter, and its activity is actually pretty well governed by a whole bunch of receptor cells in this first part of the small intestine. The first part of the small intestine is just this first little C shape here. It's interesting that the small intestine in this particular part is full of mucus to protect itself from all of the acid that's coming out of the stomach. And so there's not a lot of absorption of nutrients that happens in this first segment, but there's a lot of receptor cells in here that can actually detect the contents that are passing through and detect if they're digested enough or not. If they're not digested enough, then hormones can be released from those cells that go into the bloodstream, and they find their way back to the stomach, and they'll actually shut this off. Because if stuff is passing through here that's not digested, well, then it means that needs to churn in the stomach a little bit more. Okay, so then this would then close, so that stuff can't leave. Another thing that's interesting about the stomach is this region right here sits pretty close to the heart, so it's called, the specific region of it is called the cardia. And people that have heartburn have, what the heartburn actually is its stomach acid coming up and perpetually wearing on the mucus lining of the epithelium in the esophagus. And if the acid production is so great and the reflux is so great, they call it reflux. That means going backwards, so to speak. So if you have that acid going back up into the esophagus and not sitting in the stomach, then it can wear down the mucus here in these cells, and then it can eventually expose some nerves, and then it can scorch the nerves, and it causes a lot of pain. So that's known as heartburn. And they call it heartburn because it feels like it's happening at about the place where your heart is, because your heart, if we're looking here, your heart sits about right there. So it shares a lot of the same sensory nerves as those which are going to this part of the stomach here, the cardia. This cardia right here would be like close to as close to the heart as it can get, but still being in the abdominal cavity. All right, so that's the esophagus. There's another sphincter here. So there's one that kind of governs the entry, and then would seal shut to prevent stuff from prevent stuff from going backwards. Okay. Occasionally, though, there is some acid that does seep through, and depending on the types of food that you eat and some other conditions, it can either lead to heartburn or not. Women who are pregnant, because they've got, a big baby sitting in here, it's greatly reducing the size of the stomach, and so that acid more easily goes back up. And so if you talk to somebody who's pregnant, it's likely that they'll say they have a whole lot of heartburn perpetually, for that very reason, that their stomach's kind of squished and there's more pressure for the acid to go back where it shouldn't go. Okay, so a gate here and a gate here. The entry and the exit of contents into the stomach is actually pretty highly regulated. The main event that's happening in the stomach is the following. So if we zoom real close here into the stomach and we take a look at what that epithelium looks like that's lining the inside of the stomach, it looks something like this. It's got all these folds in it, and embedded in those folds are these pits. They're called gastric pits. And the gastric pits have specialized cells lining them. In that epithelial tissue that lines the pit, there are some specialized cells. Some of the special cells are, one, there's the chief cells. There's also the enteroendocrine cells, the G cells, which aren't really listed here. But then the other one is the parietal cells. And specifically, it's the parietal cells that make hydrochloric acid. So this is the thing that makes your stomach acidic, is the fact that there are these cells here that are making it. The chief cells, then, they actually create this thing that turns into pepsin. And pepsin is a hormone, pepsin is an enzyme that breaks down proteins. So one of the main events happening in the stomach is really protein digestion. Fats and things aren't so much digested as well, and carbohydrates aren't as much digested as well, but protein digestion, it really gets underway in the stomach because of these specialized enzymes that are released there, and the hydrochloric acid actually makes this thing work better. Okay? And it makes it easier for the big long polypeptides to be broken down into amino acids. And so when we talk about the cells here, one of the things that they're detecting is how big are the proteins coming out here. Is it just individual little amino acids, or is it big, huge proteins? Because if it's big, huge proteins, that means that the stomach's got a little bit more work to do. So it might release a hormone that actually shuts this off. Okay, so those are some of the key players there in the stomach, the parietal cells. Now, one of the things that's interesting about parietal cells is that they are a target site for a lot of pharmaceutical drugs that are used to treat heartburn. So maybe you've heard of a proton pump inhibitor. That's a class of drugs that are prescribed to people that have acid reflux, perpetual acid reflux, or heartburn. And what it means is this is a schematic of a parietal a parietal cell, and it's showing you all sorts of complex biochemical pathways here. But the one thing I want you to pay attention to is there's a pump right here. Remember, a pump is something that pushes something from a low concentration to a high concentration. So there's a low concentration of hydrogen ion inside, and there's a high concentration of sodium or hydrogen ion outside, and so it's pushing it from low to high, which requires energy. So this is a pump. That pump is driven by ATP, which is why you're seeing ATP here. So this is called the proton pump, because hydrogen ions, this thing right here, an atom of hydrogen is literally just a proton and electron. And so if the hydrogen atom loses its electron, then essentially all it is a proton. And it's the accumulation of protons, or the accumulation of hydrogen ions, that make something acidic. The scale that we use to determine if something is acidic is called the pH scale. And that pH literally stands for the concentration of hydrogen ion. That's what the H stands for. And so, as the thought goes, if you have this pump which is constantly pushing out hydrogen ions out, and that's what's making your stomach acidic, and there's perpetually too much acid in the stomach, which is then scorching your esophagus and causing an immense amount of pain, well, then the thought goes that perhaps you should just shut this thing off. Okay? and that's what proton pump inhibitors do. An example of this would be omeprazole, this drug here. Sorry, I'm kind of writing over it, but omeprazole is an example of a proton pump inhibitor, and there are others. And what it's going to do is it's going to shut this thing off. It's going to bind to this pump, shut it off, or inhibit it, so that there's less hydrogen ions being pumped out into the stomach. Now, there's a whole controversy about this because it's really easy to get addicted to these, not because they have any addictive qualities to them, but because if somebody gets on a proton pump inhibitor for too long, as soon as they go off of it, then this thing just cranks out hydrogen ions, and it just causes even more pain than probably started out with. Okay, the proton pump becomes much more activated. So people get stuck on them because as soon as they go off, then it causes an immense amount of pain again. And the problem is that you actually need hydrogen ions in your stomach to do the job that they're supposed to do, which is help digest food. So then there's some secondary complications that have been reported here for overuse of these types of drugs. People start to experience digestive problems or becoming tired because there's not as much proper digestion happening in the stomach, and so on and so forth. So kind of an interesting thing there. Generally, it's somewhat advised that if you can go without a proton pump inhibitor, it's better, and people are usually, and if you're prescribed a proton pump inhibitor, people are usually pretty cautious about making sure that you take that sparingly, only when you absolutely need to. Another thing that can be used for acid reflux or heartburn is sodium bicarbonate, which is this molecule here, or sometimes it's calcium bicarbonate. This would be like sodium bicarbonate is baking soda, and calcium carbonate is usually what's inside of like something like a Tums. Okay, and what happens is this particular molecule right here, it goes and because it has this negative charge, it goes and it binds to the hydrogen ions, and then it makes carbonic acid, H2CO3, and then that will then dissociate into water and carbon dioxide. So effectively, you're taking hydrogen ions out of the stomach, and you're making instead CO2 and water. Now, you don't have to know this whole pathway. I'm not going to. It's very similar to the pathway that they've shown here. The way to make hydrogen ions is the same as the way to remove hydrogen ions. It's just the reverse. So you don't have to know that in this class, but it is interesting to think that you can take this substance, which is going to take those hydrogen ions and make water and CO2 out of them. And it's an age-old remedy. People have been using baking soda for hundreds of years to cure an upset stomach, and it's something that I still use. I think baking soda even works. A good old tablespoon of baking soda works better than a Tum, but if you try it, be forewarned, it tastes like a dead fish. Okay, so you're gonna have to put that tablespoon in that glass of water and chug that thing while plugging your nose, because it tastes horrible. And you'll note probably that you'll have you have to burp, and when you burp, it's like it feels almost like the same burp that you'd have if you drank too much carbonated beverage, because it's CO2 coming out. And hopefully, it makes you feel better. So that would be a better solution than getting on a prescription proton pump inhibitor like this if you had occasional acid reflux, in my opinion. But again, I'm not a doctor, so don't take my don't take my medical advice. Okay. Now, one point of interest is where the main accessory organs of digestion converge. So the liver and then another one is the gallbladder, and another one is the pancreas. They all kind of come together in this one little injection port. So what we're seeing here, this is the stomach. Again, stomach releases acid, which helps you break down proteins. There's also a lot of motility in the stomach. There's 3 layers of muscle that churn and churn and churn to kind of like mix everything up. Okay, now right out the gate then of all of the stuff that's just been digested in the stomach, now stuff is ready to be absorbed and broken down even further. Okay, like you can think about the stomach being like the first place that stuff is kind of broken down, and then over the next few inches of the small intestine is where it's then broken down fully, and then somewhere about in the middle of the small intestine is where then stuff is starting to be absorbed quite readily. So this little injection port right here is going to push bile into your small intestine. And then also the pancreas is going to be pushing a whole bunch of enzymes, digestive enzymes in here. So you've got just a cocktail of digestive type substances being injected into this part of the small intestine. Is greatly going to increase your ability to digest foods. What bile does, bile is stored in the gallbladder. It's made in the liver, and then it comes down here and it's stored in the gallbladder. And when some of those cells detect that something has just left the stomach is now in need of digestion, those cells will release a hormone which actually squeezes this sac, the gallbladder, and when it squeezes, it should shoot out some bile. Now, what bile is, or what it's called, is an emulsifier. And what an emulsifier does is it basically breaks big things down into little things, and specifically in the case of bile, we're talking about fats. So imagine you consume something that's oily and you've got these big drops of oil that have passed through your stomach. Some of the acid in your stomach will work to break oil down, but whatever remains then is going to be worked on by the bile. So bile will have molecules in it that will actually try and come up to this drop of oil and strip it into smaller bits of oil. Okay, so then before long, this big drop of oil has been stripped into a bunch of little drops of oil, which are much more easy to absorb. It's very difficult to absorb a big drop of oil like this across the intestinal epithelium. It's much easier to then break down and absorb a smaller droplet like this. So that's what bile is doing. The pancreas then is going to put a whole bunch of enzymes in here. Some of them are going to break down protein, like trypsin is one. So trypsin is similar to pepsin. It breaks down protein further, anything that still remains to be digested. It also has, there's a lipase that the pancreas releases that breaks down fats even further. So bile kind of does the bulk of it, but then the lipase will go in and break apart those small droplets and actually cleave the triglycerides apart. The pancreas also releases amylase, which breaks down big carbohydrates. It releases different nucleases, which will break down DNA and nucleic acids. So a whole bunch of digestive enzymes in the pancreas to help break stuff down. Now, when people hear of pancreas, they generally think of glucose regulation. So they think of these two hormones here, insulin, and the other one, which is less known, is glucagon. Insulin and glucagon help to maintain your blood sugar. Okay, but that's a hormone action, and less than 1% of the pancreas, less than 1% of the pancreatic cells are involved in making insulin and/or glucagon. So a bulk of the pancreas is actually not an endocrine organ. It's a bulk of it's just a digestive organ, creating enzymes to break stuff down. Regardless of what's made and where it's made, it all kind of gets injected into here. And this is one of the greatest names ever, I think. The Sphincter of Oddi. I don't know who Oddi was, but he sure has forever immortalized himself in this awesome name, talking about the place where that can open or close to let these digestive enzymes and substances into the small intestine. Okay, so this is a big area for the digestive system. This is like a key place where stuff is going to be broken down so that then as things traverse further down the small intestine, they can hopefully be absorbed into your blood. And then once they're absorbed into the blood, the blood will send it out to a bunch of different cells. Actually, one of the main places that all of the nutrients that come from the intestines will have to pass through is the liver. So the blood that carries away these nutrients that are absorbed, it generally gets rerouted back to the liver. Liver will process it, and then from there, hopefully the nutrients and things have been taken out and something's been done with them. Okay, so that's an important area. From here, there's a couple different parts of the small intestine which we won't talk about, but this one's just about 10 inches or so, or maybe it's 10 centimeters. It's really quite short, the first part, and then the other two parts are a little bit longer, and they're a little better suited for absorbing nutrients. Okay, then we get to this place here at the end of the small intestine. There's an interesting merge between the small intestine and this, which is the large intestine. So the large intestine is what you see here that wraps around the periphery of the abdominal cavity. The large intestine is also called the colon. Specifically, it has several colons that make it. So there's one that goes up, so it's called the ascending colon. There's one that goes across the side, so it's called the transverse colon. There's one that goes down, so it's called the descending colon. And then there's one that's shaped like an S, so it's called the sigmoid colon. And then the rectum is like the final waiting place for your fecal material before it presses then on the anus. What's interesting about the anus is there's actually two rings of muscle that surround it. The one that's on the inside is involuntary, meaning you can't control it. And so what happens is if your fecal material is getting packed into the rectum, it's going to start to press on that sphincter, and it will start to open. And as soon as it opens is when it's now then pressing on the external sphincter, and that's the one that you can actually control by your will. So like when you feel like you really have to go to the bathroom, what's happening is that the internal sphincter is starting to relax. You can't control it. It just starts to relax, and then the only thing that's keeping the poop from coming out is the external sphincter, which is you're actively having to squeeze closed, and then when you're ready, you can relax that one, and then everything slides right out, hopefully. Okay, the large intestine, its main job is less for absorbing. The small intestine should have mostly everything absorbed by then. One of the things that is absorbed in the small intestine is water. So any remaining water is absorbed here. There's still going to be kind of a slurry of material when it's coming into the large intestine, which is good because if all of the water was sucked right out of it in the small intestine, then it would just be hard for it to move, and it would get stuck and caught, and it would not be a great thing. So it is lucky for us that there is still quite a bit of water here in that slurry of food stuff, and then it's only here towards the very end that that water then is pulled out completely, forming more of a solid mass. Now, the muscles here there's these ribbons of muscle that go along. There's 3 of them that go along the colon. They actually contract to squeeze this down, so you can see how these little pouches here. It's kind of like an accordion where it opens up and then they can squeeze down and it opens up, and it squeezes down and it opens up and it squeezes down. And what it's going to do is it's going to compact and compact and compact and compact. So eventually, hopefully, like a solid mass of food stuff that we would call then fecal material is made. Those are called segmentation contractions, and you can't really feel them. They just kind of happen when they're going to happen. There's also a valve here called the ileocecal valve. The first part of the large intestine is called the cecum. That's this little pouch here. And then this is the ileum, which is the last part of the small intestine, so that's why it's called ileocecal. But it's important to have a valve here because there's relatively small amount of bacteria in the small intestine. There's a whole bunch of bacteria in the large intestine. And having a valve here prevents a whole bunch of bacteria from getting back into the small intestine. There's a new condition, or not new, but it's a little bit less understood or less known, that's becoming more popular, called SIBO, which basically stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And it's a condition in which there's too many bacteria in the small intestine. And again, not a whole lot of well-defined parameters here, but I've got some friends who've had some medical issues and they couldn't figure out what was wrong with them. They were chronically tired, and they tried everything and nobody could figure out what was wrong with them, and then they were diagnosed with SIBO, and so they started undergoing treatments for that. The valve here would prevent that from happening. Also, right outside of the valve is the appendix, and it's thought that the appendix was a vestigial structure, but now it's appearing like there's some immune cells that hang out here, and so it's a place where bacteria can kind of come and present themselves to the immune cells, and it can activate the immune cells to any type of bacteria that has entered your body. So it's kind of like screening the bacteria in here to make sure that there's not any really nasty ones, as far as I understand it. Okay, the bacteria that are living in your large intestine, it's very good that you have them in your large intestine. They make two things for you, among other things. They make two important things: vitamin K and also vitamin B12. So it's like you got a little mini pharmacy in here. You're not able to make these, and the bacteria make them for you. The bacteria here will further break down lipids, generally further break down more complex lipid molecules that you weren't able to break down during your small intestine. And there's actually quite a bit of research now underway about the nature of the bacteria in your large intestine and obesity. Because it's thought that if the colonies of bacteria that are in your large intestine are highly active, what they'll do is they'll break down those complex lipid molecules further so that you can absorb them. If the bacterial colonies are not very active in your large intestine, well, then you don't break those down and absorb them. Instead, they are passed in your feces. And an interesting story, somebody I know was going to the doctor, and he's really, really skinny, really fit, and the doctor looked at him and he's like, I know this is kind of a weird question, but does your poop float? He's like, excuse me, when you poop in the toilet, does the poop float? And he was asking that question because somebody that has not very active bacterial colonies in their large intestine would have more lipid content in their fecal matter, and if there's more lipid content, then the poop would float in the toilet, right? Whereas if the bacteria here are very active, they're breaking apart all of those molecules, and then there is very little lipid content left by the time it's excreted, and so then it would be less likely to float. It would sink. And I think my friend said that it did float, so it kind of corroborates that notion that the amount of lipid content your body is able to absorb could be determined by the what's known as the microbiota, the microbiome of your large intestine, the assortment of bacteria and the nature of the bacteria in that large intestine. All right, a little bit there about the digestive system. Now, some of the highlights here on the urinary system. One of my favorites. It's relatively simple on the surface. There's not a whole lot of parts to it. Basically, four main parts. There's the kidney, there's the ureter, there's the bladder, and there's the urethra. The kidney is going to be the thing that produces urine. That urine is brought to and stored in the bladder via the ureter. The ureter is the tube that carries the urine all the way down. Okay, and then from here it waits, and then when the muscles that keep the urethra closed are opened, then it can then expel out of the urethra. So pretty simple set of structures here on the surface, but once we get to the microanatomy, that's when things start getting really complex. And while I would like to go into a large degree of complexity, I'll try and keep it mostly surface level here for you all. Here's what a kidney looks like. I won't go through a lot of the structures here, but the one thing I'll note is that here's the renal vein and the renal artery, and 25% of all the cardiac output, 25% of all the blood flow coming out of your heart goes through this vessel. And the kidney's quite small compared to your body. So the fact that 1/4 of all the blood leaving your heart goes to this small organ should tell you that there's a lot of blood flow proportionally to your body going through here, which is good, because what the kidney's going to do is it's going to regulate your blood pressure. If you have too much, let's say you're absorbing too much water into your small intestine, well, that water goes into your blood. And then now you've got more liquid in your blood vessels. If you have more liquid in your blood vessels, it causes an increase in blood pressure, because anytime you put more liquid into a closed space, it builds pressure. So the kidney then is going to take that fluid back out. So the kidney's involved in water balance. If you drink a cup of water, that water goes into your blood, it increases your blood pressure, and then that pushes the fluid out through the kidney, and then it's excreted as urine. And then now that cup of water that you absorbed is now then gone through the blood and left, so you don't have a net high blood pressure. Hopefully that is maintained. It's very important to keep a high blood pressure because we have these long necks that are subject to gravity, and it's the high blood pressure that we have that pushes against the workings of gravity on the column of fluid in our neck, basically the carotid artery. So if we didn't have a high blood pressure, then there wouldn't be enough pressure to shoot. Basically, there wouldn't be enough pressure to propel blood into your brain and push it against the flow of gravity. And if there's not enough pressure to continually perfuse the brain with blood, well, then you die, right? So it's very important that the brain is always receiving blood flow, and maintaining a high blood pressure is helpful for that. Now, on the flip side, you don't want to have too high of a blood pressure, because if you have the higher your blood pressure is, the harder your heart has to work to then overcome that pressure and push blood through your cardiovascular system. So your blood pressure is pretty well regulated. It's high enough that it can perfuse your brain, but not so high that it's excessively taxing on your heart to propel blood through your blood vessels. The kidney is one of the main instruments used to maintain that narrow range of blood pressure. And it will do it by releasing a whole array of hormones that lead to a whole cascade of events, and it's really quite fascinating. If you ever want to learn more about it, just talk to me after class, but for this sake, I'll spare you the details here. What I want you to pull out from this slide, though, is look at where the blood is going. Okay, the blood from your heart is going through the renal artery, and eventually it's going into what is known as these cortical blood vessels. Cortical because they're radiating out into the cortex of the organ. The cortex is this outer part here. Okay, so you've got the blood is eventually radiating out into the cortex of the entire organ. And those blood vessels would also be here. They're just not shown for simplicity's sake. So a lot of blood is reaching the very far reaches of the cortex of your kidney. Now, what is there? Why is that the destination? What is there that is the source of all of that blood flow? Why do we have to send blood that far out? The answer is that the nephron sits there. So this right here is one of those branches off of the renal artery. So when I go over here and I show you these little branches here, what those branches are is this branch here. So this is the sort of the final destination of that blood that's come from your heart. Then off of this trunk there are these little baby trunks, and there would be a whole bunch of them. We're only seeing really one of them here in this particular image. What's going to happen is that blood's going to come off, and then it's going to go through this really crazy capillary network, and then it's going to leave. Okay, the inlet into this capillary network is called the afferent arteriole, and the place that it leaves is called the efferent arteriole. And oftentimes, the efferent arteriole is more narrow, and the afferent arteriole is more open. So if the inlet, and that's not shown on this picture, okay? So if the inlet is open and the outlet is closed, you can imagine that fluid is going in and it's got nowhere to go, essentially, so it's creating a bottleneck here. It's driving the pressure of the fluid in this network of capillaries up. And it's that pressure that's created which is actually going to push fluid out of the blood vessels and into this little space here, which is called the capsular space. So this thing right here is called the renal capsule. It's also called Bowman's capsule. In either case, it's just like this empty, it's this container, so to speak, that wraps around the blood vessels here. This is the big divide between the cardiovascular system and the urinary system. They're very tied together, and they will regulate one another. But the big divide where the fluid stops becoming blood plasma and it starts becoming urine is right here. This would be the divide. In here, the fluid is blood plasma. In here, the fluid is on its way to becoming urine. Essentially, all of your urine is pretty much the same thing as blood plasma to begin with, and then it just gets altered and altered as it progresses down. This whole structure is called the nephron, I should say, by the way, and that's known as the functional unit of the kidney because there's millions of them in your kidney, and it's the thing that's actually doing the work of producing urine. And that one nephron is shown here. Okay, that's the capsule. Now the first part of the nephron after the fluid has left the blood is this little squirrely thing of Benz, and so it's called the proximal convoluted tubule. It's called convoluted because convoluted means anything but a straight line. Convoluted means it goes to and from, up and down, all around. Proximal because there's actually two places where the tubes are like this, and proximal means closest to the source. So there's another place where the tubes go round and round and bend, and that's over here. So this is called the distal convoluted tubule. So you have a proximal convoluted tubule and you have a distal convoluted tubule. You can just abbreviate these if you like, PCT and DCT. Okay, and then in the middle there's a big loop, like that. That's called the nephron loop. Nothing too complicated there. And then what you're going to note is that the afferent arteriole continues on, and then it branches into this wide array of blood vessels that wrap around all the tubing of the nephron. All that tubing is called the peritubular capillaries. Peritubular meaning it surrounds the tube, meaning the nephron tubes, and capillaries because it's actually a blood vessel. So here's how it works. You have a whole bunch of fluid that's driven out of the blood and into the nephron right here. I should say that this big knot here of capillaries does have a name to it that is called the glomerulus. Okay, so that fluid leaves and it goes and goes and goes and goes. Now, initially, all of the fluid that's left is very similar to your blood plasma. So it's got plenty of sugar in it, it's got amino acids and vitamins and nutrients, all stuff that your body doesn't necessarily want to get rid of. But at this point, it doesn't really have the ability to differentiate. It just literally, fluid is just pushed out. So the body is going to work to reclaim all of the things that it wants that it accidentally, so to speak, lost at this event here. So a lot of nutrients are going to be reabsorbed back into the blood. So these blood vessels that are in close association with the tubes, they can actually receive through diffusion the nutrients that were lost. And so those nutrients are reclaimed. Most of the reabsorption does occur here in these first segments of the nephron, the proximal convoluted tubule. What's going to happen in the nephron loop is it's going to establish what's known as an osmotic gradient. And that's just a big fancy word for varying degrees of saltiness. So how it works is that salt that is in the blood plasma is kicked out, and then it's kicked out again, and it's kicked out again. And for because of a pretty complicated process, which I won't talk about, there's actually more salt that is kicked out at the bottom of this loop. There's a medium amount of salt that's kicked out here, and then there's a very little bit that's kicked out here. So an osmotic gradient means that from the outside of the kidney, so the cortex, down to the deeper parts, the inside of the kidney, it goes from being less salty to more salty. And this is actually super important because it's this very osmotic gradient, the fact that it's less salty towards the outskirts of the kidney and more salty towards the inside of the middle of the kidney, that will help your body determine how much water is lost, or it will, in other words, to help you determine how concentrated your urine is. So by the time fluid has gone through the proximal convoluted tubule, gone through the nephron loop, and gone through the distal convoluted tubule, now it's going down this tube, which is called the collecting duct. And at this point, it's pretty much the same thing as your urine. It's just maybe has too much water or too little water in it. Okay, so this final conduit, this final place, the collecting duct where the urine will pass through before it goes down and collects into the middle of the kidney and then drains through the ureter to the urinary bladder, this is the final opportunity the body has to reclaim any of the water that was initially lost right here. Okay, so again, you're losing fluid. It's being driven out of the blood into the nephron, and then it goes through and things are reabsorbed and it's changed and modified to become urine. Right here, then, it's his last opportunity for any remaining fluid to be reclaimed. And if the body needs to reclaim fluid, what it does is it puts these little channels in here, which are called aquaporins. And those channels will allow the water to get pulled back out into the kidney. Remember, water is the particle party animal. It likes to go wherever there's the most amount of particles. And so if your body needs to reclaim a lot of water, it will open up a whole bunch of channels here, and then because it's so salty down here, it's really going to pull out a lot of water. If your body only needs to reclaim a little bit of water, it won't put any of these channels in here. It will instead put those channels way up here, where there's still going to be some water driven out because it's salty, but it's not nearly as salty as it is further down in the inner recesses of the kidney. So in either case, your body can basically determine how much water needs to be reclaimed, and it has a mechanism for reclaiming just the amount that it needs to based upon where these channels are inserted into the collecting duct and how many of them there are. Now, I bring this up because one thing that's interesting, and this is not, you're all probably too young to be thinking about this, but those who drink alcohol will tell you that when they drink alcohol, one of the things that happens is they have to pee a lot. Okay, well, what alcohol does is it inhibits the hormone that tells the body to put these those channels in. So if you're inhibiting the thing that's putting these channels in, then the channels will not be put in there. And if the channels are not put in there, then even though you should be reclaiming water, you're not, because there aren't any channels there to let the water through. So the water instead goes down and is passed and excreted as urine. So this is why alcohol, even though it is a fluid that you're consuming, it actually dehydrates the person that's consuming it, because it's leading to an abnormal amount of water being lost, and because alcohol is causing the inhibition of the channel that is needed to reclaim the water. Okay, so all sorts of interesting stuff here, and that's the urinary system. And there's, I mean, you can get into a whole big new arena here of thought, talking about what is it that governs the nephron. Like, for example, there's a whole bunch of specialized cells here. And actually what really happens is that the distal convoluted tubule, it's not shown in this picture, but it does pass, like it will pass through very close to where these cells are. So like if I was to draw a cross section, it'd be like right here. And these cells can actually detect how salty that fluid is, and they can release hormones which can have systemic effects across your entire body. They're very powerful hormones. Those are the hormones that would activate your thirst centers in your brain. So if you've ever feel thirsty, that signal, where it ultimately came from, is probably one of these itty bitty little cells here right next to the glomerulus that was monitoring your fluid coming through the nephron and saying, ooh, that's a little too salty, so you better drink some water. So it released a hormone, and then that hormone went to your lungs, and it got converted to another hormone, and then that hormone went to your medulla oblongata, and then that hormone went to your hypothalamus, and then told you that you were thirsty. So it's pretty complex. That's one example. There's a lot of other things that these powerful hormones do. So pretty fascinating physiology there in the urinary system. Okay, that's going to wrap it all up for our little highlight of the digestive system and the urinary system.